I read about the Vikings and their exploration where they were able to reach the Americas. Now let's talk about them during the time of France and the Carolingian Empire. Before we hit the Carolingian Empire, I think it's important to understand concerning about the time of Europe that there was a very powerful man that time. His name is Charlemagne. All right, Charlemagne, he's a great type of the Antichrist. If it wasn't for him, then the Roman Catholic Church, they may not have carried on in great power. He was carrying on the Merovingian Dynasty. The Merovingian Dynasty and their line of kings, they were very powerful and they conquered much of Europe. They are basically the tribes that covered the Franks. Now, you remember that the Frankish tribes, that they were one of the 10 tribes that caused a lot of the split of the Roman Empire and a bunch of pagans that took over. As centuries passed by, Charlemagne became king of the Franks. And it is from the region of France, France, okay. It is from the region of France, but he was basically taking over like empires and many different countries. Modern states of Italy, for example, Germany and France. So remember, the empire was so broken up. So Charlemagne had a lot of work to work within his inner empire to get them all united and to control and manage them. And at the same time, he had to conquer land after land and many different tribes and kingdoms. So this man was undoubtedly very powerful. In page 203, Frederick Widowson's work, A Bible Believer Looks at World History. The greatest of medieval kings who ruled an empire, modern France and Germany, was born in 742. His name was Charlemagne. The Merovingian dynasty had ruled the Frankish tribes in what is now France, okay? Since before the Great Clovis in the late 400s forced Catholic Christianity upon his subjects. So for some of you who don't know, at the 400s, I didn't really cover this guy, but this guy Clovis was very important where he was able to force Catholicism upon the pagan tribes. So if it weren't for these powerful kings, the Catholic Empire would have been vanished a long time ago. So it is through these emperors, these kings like Clovis and definitely Charlemagne, that the Catholic Church retained a lot of their power. This line of kings, the Merovingian, eventually became ineffectual and basically worthless, but had produced strong major domos or mayors of the palace who did their fighting for them, like Charles Martel the Hammer, among others, who had defeated the Muslim invaders at Tours in 732, thereby stopping the northern advance of Islam into the rest of Europe from Spain. So remember, the Muslims, they were taking over territories in Spain, if you all recall that. Pepin III overthrew the impotent Merovingians and began the Carolingian Dynasty. That's the key right there. So the Vikings, they encountered during this timeline. So it was the timeline of Carolingian. All right, Carolingian Dynasty. Let's keep reading. He began the Carolingian Dynasty with Pope Zacharias' blessing. This dynasty ruled the Franks from 751 to 987. Charlemagne was his son. Charlemagne became sole king after his brother died in 771. He aided Pope Hadrian II in his struggle against the Lombard king Desiderius, who invaded the states directly controlled by the papacy. Charlemagne's victory allowed him to claim Lombardy, part of Italy, as his own. Returning to his capital of Aachen, he began a series of 53 campaigns that carved out an empire consisting of Germany, France, and part of Italy. Now that's quite a feat during that timeline, remember, because a lot of the empires were broken. He allied himself with one Muslim king in Spain against another, but was forced to return home due to a revolt in German Saxony. As he retreated through the Pyrenees, he was attacked by a force of Basques who wiped out his rear guard. This resulted in the epic poem, The Song of Roland, which was written down 3 centuries later. Finally, Charlemagne did conquer a strip of northeast Spain for his empire, so he was able to reach that far now. So he was able to push back some of the Muslims. By becoming the military wing of the papacy and forcing his empire to accept the Roman Catholic religion, Charlemagne became a type of the Antichrist to come. So see, that's how the Catholic Empire, despite of the Vikings and the Muslims and the split with the Eastern Empire, it was able to retain its power. It is because of powerful kings and emperors like Charlemagne. In 800, Pope Leo the Third crowned him Emperor of the Romans. By receiving the crown from the Pope, he affirmed, even if unwittingly, as some historians say, the Pope's authority over kings and princes and created the Holy Roman Empire. So notice that the Roman Catholic Church still hit number 1 in power, despite the Vikings and despite of the Muslims taking over. Charlemagne was a ruthless dictator who was especially cruel, Durant says, in spreading Roman Catholic Christianity by force of arms. He had 4 wives and 5 concubines, many illegitimate children, and even encouraged his daughters to forbear marriage, and they also produced many illegitimate offspring. So you can tell that this guy's a madman. He finally died in 814 and is said to have been buried. Now this is interesting. It is said that he had been buried with his finger pointed to an open Latin Vulgate on his chest. So remember, that's the Catholic Bible Jerome was responsible for. Open to Matthew 16:26. Remember, that's the Catholic's favorite chapter about Peter, where supposedly the church is founded upon Peter and the popes. Although a latter emperor, Otto the Third, reported that when he opened Charlemagne's tomb, he was sitting up on a throne and no open Bible was in sight. As is the case with most great conquerors, as you might have known, like Constantine and others, what happened to such powerful emperors with their empire? His successors were incompetent and quarrelsome. Viking invasions and demands for territory weakened their power significantly because those Vikings. So remember, the Vikings were a huge threat to Europe during the Dark Ages. They were the ones who actually hit the heart of the Catholic Empire, not the Muslims. The Muslims, remember, they were coming from the south, but they did take some Catholic territories, but the Vikings were the main threat. Viking invasions and demands for territory weakened their power significantly, as did constant infighting and civil wars. When Louis V died in 987, the nobles of France, with the approval of their archbishop, elected Hugh Capet as king, and Capetian line would rule France until the Revolution. So that's what you want to know. So then, with this Carolingian line throughout the Dark Ages, then we hit the Capetian line. And then the Revolution is going to be a very interesting subject that we'll cover later on. And it is possible that the Jesuits risen from their dead power during that timeline. But we'll come to that later. But as you can see, Catholic power was strengthened because of people like Charlemagne, and later on with France through the Capetian line. But we're going to see that France is a demonic territory that Satan mightily used to keep reviving Roman Catholic power. That's what you want to know. The Viking settlement was never achieved in the well-defended Carolingian Empire. So I'm reading from Britannica about the Vikings again. On the scale evidenced in the British Isles, and Scandinavian influence on continental languages and institutions is, outside Normandy, very slight. Sporadic raiding did occur, however, until the end of the Viking period, and in the 10th century, settlements on the Seine River became the germ of the Duchy of Normandy, the only permanent Viking achievement in what had been the empire of Charlemagne. Farther south than France, in the Iberian Peninsula, and on the Mediterranean coast, the Vikings raided from time to time, but accomplished little of permanence. So you'll notice here that the Vikings, they didn't really have much of a power or stronghold during Charlemagne's territory, the Carolingian territory. Now, let's read further on about which territory should we go next. Maybe we should hit, I think Russia would be a great place, shall we? All right, let's go to Russia. So where did Russia come from, right? We always wonder about the birthmark and the birthplace of Russia. How did they come to existence? What do they have to do with the Vikings? You'd be surprised, and the territory that you want to know that is a big play is Kiev. So you want to know that territory. We're going to look at page 215 at Whittelson's work. He mentions here, moving north of the Islamic lands, let's move to Russia. Russia before the Russians, according to Nicholas V. Ryasanovsky's A History of Russia, was first written about with references to the Slavic tribes by the classical writers of the Christian era, particularly Pliny the Elder and the historian Tacitus. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. Now remember the Eastern Empire. There was that split. Don't forget that. The Western Empire is where we would see Catholicism. So this is the west direction. The east direction is where we come to the Orthodox Church. Now, why did Russia become very dominant in religion despite of communism back then with the Orthodox Church religion? So this is how it came to be, which is going to be some interesting stuff. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire, historian Procopius wrote about them as did the Gothic Jordanes. The terms most frequently used to designate them were Venedi and Antis, with the first word often referring to the Eastern Slavs and the latter, last, title, sometimes referring to the pre-Slavic Iranian inhabitants of southern Russia or Goths. Most historians now assume that the Slavs consisted of the bulk of the inhabitants of southern Russia at the time of the biblical Scythians. So look at Colossians chapter 3, verse 11. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 11. And then you want to also look at Isaiah chapter 49, verse 12. Isaiah chapter 49, verse 12. So this is where their roots come from. We can see where the Goths played a part. Now remember, the Goths, they were basically before the Vikings. They were the terror. But the Lord mightily used Euphilus to win a lot of people to Christianity and salvation, albeit there were errors of doctrine, as we already know. But albeit the Lord mightily used it. As you turn to these passages, let me keep reading on page 216. So this is the root and the origins of the Russians. J.M. Roberts, in A History of Europe, refers to the Scythian Russians as trading with the Greeks in the middle of the first millennium BC. By the 9th century, AD East Slavic economy and culture was well developed and advanced. However, we don't get our name for this area from the Slavic people, according to Western historians. So it's not the Slavic people then. It's not where we get the root of the Scythians and where we talked about pre-Slavic Iranian inhabitants, etc., etc. Well, what do Western historians say then if it's not from the Slavic people? The Vikings, the Rus, from which we derive the name Russia, according to Gwyn Jones' A History of the Vikings, were a tribe mostly, guess what, Swedish, of commercial and military adventurers who created the first great Russian republics of Novgorod and Kiev, which started out as armed trading posts. There is actually, though, so here's interesting, that's one origin. The second, there is actually, though, a great controversy surrounding the influence and significance of the Viking settlement among the Slavic people. We're going to skip down to the second paragraph. So there is debate about origins. In Britannica, they mention this. After the 11th century, this is the wrong one. over here, it says the Eastern Viking expansion was probably a less violent process. So when the Vikings hit east. So remember, they're hitting west, but as they hit east, what was going on? The Eastern Viking expansion was probably a less violent process than that on the Atlantic coast. Although there was no doubt plenty of sporadic raiding in the Baltic, and although to go on the East Viking was an expression meaning to indulge in such activity, no Viking kingdom was founded with the sword in that area. The Great Eastern movement of the Scandinavians, so what does this have to do with Vikings and the Scandinavians, was that which carried them into the heart of Russia. The extent of this penetration is difficult to assess. Hence, that's why there's a great controversy about the origins. For although the Scandinavians were at one time dominant at Novgorod, Kiev, and other centers, like we read at Widowson's work, he mentioned those places, they were rapidly absorbed by the Slavonic population. So, see, there's that debate with if it has to do with the Slavonic population or the Vikings had a play. To which, however, they gave their name Rus, Russians. The Rus were clearly in the main traders, and two of their commercial treaties with the Greeks are preserved in the primary chronicle under 912 and 945. The Rus signatories have indubitably Scandinavian names. Occasionally, however, the Rus attempted voyages of plunder like their kinsmen in the West. Their existence as a separate people did not continue past 1050 at the latest. So notice that these Rus, it was following the example of the West of the Vikings, what they did. So which is very, very interesting. Now, there's actually a series that became very famous on the History Channel. And the History Channel, they decided, I guess, to put a little bit of fictional entertainment because people were bored with documentaries. So then they had a famous show called Vikings. And in Vikings, from what I researched, they fictionalized a lot of this. I think, I could be wrong about this, but in my research, they had a dramatic story where the Rus supposedly encountered the Vikings. That's how they dramatized the fictionalized events. So these Vikings were actually a very interesting group of people. They encountered a lot of different people and historical timelines. Let's see here. Let's go back to Widowson's work. Nevertheless, we have two contenders. So we're at the second paragraph of page 216. We have two contenders, at least, for the founding of the great Russian city, state of Kiev. The first were men of Scandinavian stock, or what were called Varangians. The Eastern Roman Byzantine Emperor had a Varangian guard at one time. Now, isn't that interesting? The Eastern, where the Orthodox Church would later lie decades later. Led by their greatest ruler, Rurik, which Jones says has overwhelming evidence, both literary and archaeological, to support them, and the second, as Ryasanovsky would suggest, were Gothic Slavic people who were only slightly influenced by Viking visitors who were absorbed into their own culture. Skipping down to the next paragraph, the important thing is that Kiev became an important trading city and center of power that was actually able to send a fleet of 200 ships to attack where? This is where, remember, the Eastern Roman Empire is at. Remember, Constantine, he founded this location for the Eastern Empire area, Constantinople. So this is how the Vikings were able to reach an effect up to here, and even the Rus, so to speak. So this is how Russia Orthodox Church and even some Viking origins, if there are, clashed all together. Let's keep reading. This happened at the year 860 and remained the commercial and political focus of Russia. And this is how it took over. It ruled nearly all of the Eastern Slavonic tribes. Kiev made 6 attempts between 860 and 1043 to take Constantinople for itself, part of an ongoing attempt by Russians to secure a post on the Mediterranean Sea. It is said, now this is how they adopted quote-unquote Christianity, which we know where the Orthodox Church came to be much later on. Shortly later on, excuse me. It is said that the Russians adopted Christianity because the established church, remember there were churches split between East and West, right? So this is how it took over. Because the established church permitted them to drink alcohol, while Islam did not. Oh, wow. That's a bad testimony. That shows that this Catholicism, where the Eastern Orthodox Church later came to be, that's how bad it was. It's worse than Islam. Can you believe that? Which doesn't say much for either the Russian leaders or the established Church of Constantinople or Rome, the Turkic-speaking Khazar kingdom of southern Russia that so dominated the crossroads cities of trade between Europe and Asia was also an influential factor in what we consider to be the history of Russia. They adopted Judaism in the 9th century and were a bulwark against the spread of Islam in Russian territory as well. So that part of your history, which some of you might not know, that's where you get the famous conspiracy theories that Jews are fake Jews. They come from the Khazars. That's what they say. But as you already know, Jews have already split well all over around the world. Throughout Europe, they were there. And then throughout Palestine, we already read that. So, I mean, if there is some part of, if these people weren't Jews who adopted Judaism, or even some Jews who came over there, that doesn't get rid of the true existence of the Jewish people. They're real. They're real. Let's see. So Russia became Christian under, or so-called Christian, right? Under Vladimir, 5th Grand Duke of Kiev. Okay, why is he important? Because this is where you, remember that ugly split where all these stupid bishops were proclaiming anathemas on each other, you know, the West and the East. You go to hell. No, you go to hell. May you burn in hell, and then damn you, and all that kind of stuff. This is a horrible, horrible testimony of Christian churches and just drunk for power. So this is at that time they were coming to their split. This Grand Duke of Kiev, who ruled from 972 until 1015, he married the sister of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II. And from that point on until the revolution of 1917, Russia in religion, art, alphabet, and coinage, Durant tells us, was a daughter of Byzantium. See, that's how rich the history is. That's why Russia can't get rid of this. It's a rich history of Byzantium. I mean, this is before the communists came in. So this is how rich their roots are. They went on for over a millennia almost, pretty much. So they went on for centuries and centuries. Man, can you imagine if the Roman Empire didn't split, how much more dangerous of a system it would be? They're very powerful, these people. They're very powerful. That's why Islam is, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it's supposedly the world's largest religion now. Why? Because they're a fast-growing religion. But if the Catholicism combined with the Orthodox Church, they'd be way larger than Islam, actually. The Kievan state grew to its greatest under Vladimir's son Yaroslav from 1036 to 1054, the year of the Great Schism between the Roman Catholic Church in the West and its eastern counterpart. All right. So that's where we come to the end, and we hear about the interesting story about the Vikings in Russia. Now, let's return back in Widowson's work. We're going to go back to the previous chapter. Who should we cover next? Let's cover the Ottos. They're the next powerful group that you want to know that time. So basically, Otto the Great. And unlike Charlemagne, Otto carried his latter reigns. The people who took over him, they increased or expanded the power. And that included Otto the Second, as well as Otto the Third. Now, these guys, I mean, Charlemagne had huge swaths of territory, so that's why he's probably a greater focus compared to Otto. But if you actually look at the Ottos, I mean, they were conquering a huge chunk of land as well from Germany. And not only that, they could have been more dangerous than Charlemagne in bringing in the Antichrist Roman Catholic Babylon. I mean, maybe the tribulation could have happened. I don't know if you knew this, but during the time of the Dark Ages, people were expecting the tribulation to happen any moment, or the apocalypse to happen. They were expecting revelation to unfold. Why? Because you look at the Dark Ages, man. It was not a happy place to be in. You got Vikings coming from somewhere. You'd be scared if there's a bunch of Max O'Neills coming from nowhere. And then you'd be scared that there's a bunch of Muslims coming in from the south. And then the churches are splitting and dividing, and you got corrupt leaders. I mean, you would think this is the end of the world. Now, going to page 206. Now, I'm going to combine a little bit of emphasis that I've done my own research on the Ottos, so you can confirm some of it through your own research. But I'm going to mainly base it off of Widowson's work on page 206. Page 206. Otto the First, the Great, was the Charlemagne of Germany. So that's how big he was. And I better put their empire here. So we remember Charlemagne. He's covering where basically the region of France was at, and then expanded into different territories. The Ottos would be covering the area where Germany is. Okay. Going back, 24 at his succession, he created a German church tied to the state, and united a powerful state consisting of present-day German and Austria, loosely allied to the Pope. You got to realize the Pope could have lost his power if it weren't for Otto the Great. Otto the Great and even his lineage were even forcing some means where the popes had to comply a bit. So that's how powerful these guys were. Charlemagne and Otto, if it weren't for them, who knows what would have happened to papal power. Continuing reading on. He also successfully defeated the Magyar tribe who had invaded his realm. Responding to an appeal for aid from Pope John XII, he conquered Italy. See that? Look at that. Why is Vatican City so powerful? Why does Pope get the Italian territory? Because of Otto. See that? I mean, the Catholic Church would not have gotten so much power if it weren't for these people. So that's the only reason why Roman Catholicism was able to maintain their power. The Pope was able to maintain his power in Italy. So, as a result, what did he get? The Pope's blessing. Otto was crowned Roman Emperor of the West by the Pope in 962. Why? Because of blindness to religion. Blindness to religion. If that religion did not exist, Otto would not have done that for him. So that's the achievements of Otto the Great. Now let's go to Otto the Second. So Germany, it was expanding to territories where they reached parts of Italy. And if you go to Central Europe where Germany was, it was like spreading out. It was like reaching out. It was just growing like this. Otto the Second. Now what's his main key? So we see the main key with Otto the Great, where he was able to get the blessings of the Pope and conquer Italy for him. Otto the Second, the big thing that you want to know about him, this is crucial why he was dangerous in power, married the daughter of Romanus II, the what? Byzantine emperor. Wow. You talk about something where you can combine East and West again then maybe, eventually. But what happened? He died trying to conquer southern Italy. All right. Good thing that didn't happen then. Otto the Third. This is where it went really close. So this is a crucial thing you want to know about Otto the Third. Starting in 996, attempted to unite all Christendom, so that's the Roman Catholic Empire, under a revived Roman Empire ruled from Rome. This guy, if you read about how he tried to revive it, he tried to team up with the Pope. It was pretty dangerous. Like he was trying to go back to the ancient days of Rome. And he was trying to revive some of the elements. And I believe, I could be wrong, but even some Byzantine elements. Why? Because Rome used to be unified back then. But I could be wrong about that. But I do know that he tried to revive ancient Roman elements and then combine it with Roman Catholic religion. This guy would have been the Antichrist to come that Paul would have warned at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where the Roman Caesars of that time could have been the Antichrist during that church age time period of Paul. This figure and typology of the Antichrist to come at the end of the church age installed his own pope, Gebhard. So see, this guy even installed his own pope. That's how much power he had. But his early death canceled his dream. Henry II elevated the empire to its height, conquering territory and bringing a brief golden age to Central Europe. After Henry II, who's next? He appointed 2 popes himself. And the line of the Ottos was very powerful, as you can tell. The next one is Henry IV. Fought with Pope Gregory VII. Why? Who had forbade the appointment of powerful bishops by laymen in a dispute called the investiture controversy that would last for centuries, and for Henry IV resulted in a 10-year war of diplomacy and violence that ended in his death in 1106. So the Catholic Church weren't being pushed around anymore. Enough was enough. So notice that these 2 were great types of Antichrist, and that's how the Catholic Church was able to increase and maintain their power if it weren't for these 2 gentlemen. Gentlemen, I say that very loosely, and for these 2 types of Antichrist, I should rather say. Going to page 205. Now, this is where it gets dramatic. All right, we're going to cover a whole bunch of kings, okay? And hopefully I can cover this at a much more easy pace. So let's see how much I can cover here. England. Heart of the action. Remember, that's where all the Vikings were coming into. England was the place where it was heavily attacked. Now, I don't know if you recall, but I kind of read through it briefly or nonchalantly. If you recall on page 203, under Alfred, English culture was maintained and protected. And I mentioned as I read Britannica, overall English was protected. Viking didn't take everything over. But you got to realize that after Alfred's death, the Vikings, they were able to have a hand in taking over because of basically Canute the Dane. So Canute the Dane is important. So from the Danish line. So because of that, that's why the Vikings, it was mingled with English culture. But overall, it's very surprising that English culture and civilization was maintained. The Britons' culture was maintained despite a Viking takeover. And then the Vikings eventually came to non-existence as time passed by. So let's read how this happened. Proceeding to the period after the expectations of the end of the world were dashed, when the end of the first millennium came and went, the Viking conquest of England under Canute was brutal, and although he is heralded by historians as a true statesman, he was also extremely cruel to the English at first. So the first one you want to know as we go in order is Canute the Dane. Now let's see how the kings keeps passing down as we continue onwards throughout history. He did, however, marry the widow of the defeated English king, a woman who was the daughter of the Norman Duke Richard I, making an alliance with her brother, who was now the Duke. He accepted Catholic Christianity and built many churches, thereby ingratiating himself to Rome. So notice that this Viking pagan culture was mixed with Catholicism. That's not a surprise. Look at the Franks, look at the Goths, look at all the pagan tribes, the heathens who conquered the Roman Empire. What did they do? They adopted the Catholic religion. This religion is the bigger issue, not the secular power. The spiritual system is more of a threat than the physical system, you got to understand. Physical systems come and go. The Roman Empire comes and goes, but not its religion. That's important to understand. Religion is so important to understand. If you, think about how the Muslims increased in power and why they're still powerful, their religion. The key is the founder was not an idiot, although a lot of things were idiotic in his life. There was one thing he had a brain on, and that's using religion for the people. If you have religion, you give something where people are willing to die for. All right, let's keep reading here. He also managed to keep continuity in Anglo-Saxon England by continuing cultural norms and legal systems. Finally, after his insecure, youthful rule, he became himself more and more English, and ultimately he brought the Isles 12 years of peace. So see, English culture became the dominance. He began to appoint only the English to positions of authority. So that's how English culture was protected and maintained. He was not only king of England, but king of Denmark And in 1028, he was king of Norway as well. Wow, that's a huge swath of land and power. Yep. To quote Durant, he came in as a Dane and died as an Englishman. Culturally, the Danish invasion was a disaster, but the English recovered, and architecture and the literature that Alfred promoted returned after a time. Canute died at the young age of 40 in 1035. Before the last Danish king, Harthacnut, so we come to the last Danish king now in England, and his name is Harthacnut, died, he summoned from Normandy, now this is interesting, he summoned from Normandy the surviving son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma, and recognized his Anglo-Saxon stepbrother as a new king of England. Now look at this, as Whittleson says, what a twist, huh? So where it was mostly Viking, now remember, I don't know if you recall your culture, England's already a mess, so you might not remember. There's Vikings, and remember there's what? Anglo-Saxon. Why? Because of the pagan tribes, like the Saxons, and then the other people from the Anglo tribes, so to speak. They conquered England. Before them was, remember, it was Celtic Britons. So look at this huge mess. But now you're going to summon something from Normandy now. Now, for some of you who don't know about Normandy, before it was France that time, where today's official boundary line of France, you got to realize Normandy is located in modern-day France today. But obviously, the empires are so split, and it was smaller at that time, or probably bigger, I don't know. But Normandy is a location that is at the bottom of England and the top of France, so to speak. So now you're combining all this together. England, you wonder why you get your flat-footed mess of languages today? Yeah. I mean, where do you get fiancé from, for example, and all that, right? I mean, that's such an English word, isn't it? Okay. Who is this king that he summoned? It gets better and better, but it gets better and more soap opera-like. The new king, Edward the Confessor. That's the big name you want to know. Edward the Confessor. Let's continue reading onward. Was as much a foreigner as any Dane, having lived at the Norman, right, like Normandy, court since the age of 10. He brought his French language and priests to England, and his friends became high officials, religious and secular. He gave them royal grants, built Norman castles, and permitted them to show contempt for his English subjects, spurring on the Norman conquest decades before it actually happened by force of arms. So the English people, they were not happy about that. So now you're enforcing Norman culture. This guy is very important because he became more powerful than Edward the Confessor. There was only one Englishman, who had the power to influence the Norman acting English king, and that was Earl Godwin. Okay, so how did he become so powerful then and was able to influence the king? How he was able to do it, notice, it's through marriages and through pleasing the king where he was granted power. Governor of Wessex and first counselor to the Danish kings that preceded Edward. Wow, so he has a rich history line of Danish kings being their counselor. So he has a rich history, so that's one. The second thing is he became a powerful influence, and his daughter even married the king. See that? That's two. Edward, though, had no children. Godwin's son, Tostig, married the daughter of the Count of Flanders, and Godwin's nephew, Sweyn, became ruler of Denmark, making Earl Godwin the most powerful man. How about that? So Godwin's family members, they all have powerful positions. So because of that, that's why Earl Godwin increased in power. By alliances in Northern Europe, even more powerful than the king himself. So what happened? Out of envy, Edward's Norman friends convinced him to depose Godwin, who then fled to Flanders. But how was he able to come back? His son, Harold Godwinson. Okay, so the text doesn't mention his last name, but I'll write it for you. This guy is very important because he takes over as king, actually, after Edward. So the next one is Harold Godwinson. And then the next person, you'd be surprised. But let's keep reading. His son Harold went to Ireland and raised an army against Edward the Confessor's Norman-dominated government. English nobles, resentful of the haughty Normans, who were only 1 or 2 generations away from their barbaric Viking ancestors, asked Godwin to return and promised support to overthrow Edward's friends. So Godwin, he teamed up with the English people. Why? Because the English people already had a uncomfortable position against the Norman powerful rulers under Edward the Confessor. So what happened? They did. Harold and his father Godwin, with their loyal troops, invaded England and ran off the Normans who surrounded the king. So basically, Edward's friends were basically run off because, remember, they were the ones responsible for persuading the king to kick out the earl. So obviously the earl was restored his position. But guess what happened? Godwin then died. Just that sudden. So it was that quick. Harold went on to conquer Wales for England and presented Edward with the head of Welsh chieftain Rufid. Unless I'm pronouncing that wrong, I don't know. But let's continue on. Edward had begun building Westminster Abbey in 1055, and he was laid to rest there in 1066. So Edward the Confessor, Harold Godwinson, was able to take over the next powerful position over his father, serving Edward Confessor where his position was restored. But this is now very interesting. Now who's going to take over the throne of Edward the Confessor? It's Harold, right? Well, however, William, Duke of Normandy, illegitimate son of Robert I, also claimed the throne. Who is this guy? Yes, William the Conqueror. Some of you may have heard that name before, or maybe never heard that name before, but that's the next famous name. So then, we could probably guess who won, but we're going to stop right here with our history on England. We're going to have to come back to them when we come to the church age of Sardis. All right? So that's where we stop with the history of England. So now there's this there's this conflict and clash with Harold Godwinson and William the Conqueror. So what's the result? If you look at the last sentence of the paragraph, Norman England, a combination of Celtic Britain, Anglo-Saxon, French, and Viking civilization, had officially begun. There's your mess. So that rich mixture finally began when William the Conqueror started to take things over. But we're going to come back to England later on in life. What is going on with China? Go back to go to 219. 219. So now, China, we know that they were able to maintain their power and their empire. Remember, their richness of their empire relied a lot on basically a socialist, communist platform. Remember that? So guess what? Their rulers are going to repeat the same methods. But just like we've seen throughout history, it doesn't matter if you force things to create a benevolent society, is that sudden natural catastrophes happen, and that changes the game. And number two, people lose their individual powers or their rights, and they don't take that willingly. So remember, this kind of ideal world is basically fantasy, and it doesn't work. So the Han Dynasty, remember that? That's one of the last dynasties that we were covering about the Han Dynasty. And remember, they were able to successfully kick out what were supposedly the Huns of that time. And then the Huns moved toward the Western Roman Empire. So what went on with China during that whole time? Let's come to here. Now we'll move east to China. Following the Han Dynasty, and after a further century of weak governing, a long period of division into northern and southern dynasties from 317 to 589. Okay, so let's go through their dynasties. China has a lot of them, obviously. We were covering a lot about Han Dynasty. Now let's pass where we go to Northern and Southern Dynasties. After that led finally to a new unification. So North and Southern Dynasties finally had a new unification. The Sui accomplished the reunification, ruling from 581 to 618. Reading from F.W. Mote's book Imperial China, we learn that the Chinese civilization had experienced a golden age of culture under the Tang Dynasty. So under the Tang Dynasty, that's where we're covering now. Tang Dynasty is where we're hitting, and you want to know that. That existed from 618 to 907. The Tang Dynasty, founded by Cao Su, experienced its greatest emperor under its son, Taisung, from 627 to 650. So went from Cao Su, which was the founder. Okay, so let me just write all these names out. That way people can follow along. Let's see here. Okay. The greatest emperor that they had after him was Taisung. Let's see here. Taisung. So that was its greatest emperor. From 627 to 650. By greatest, the historians mean to say that he murdered his brothers who were rivals for his throne and drove the barbarians back and reestablished Chinese authority over territories that had been lost since the collapse of the Han Dynasty. So during this North and South time, they didn't have a unified dynasty. And this went on for a long, long time. But now he's reviving it again. Suddenly, he is said to have grown tired of war and retired to study, read, and publish the writings of Confucius. His capital of Chang'an became so beautiful that Durant says that tourists flocked to it from India and Europe. We're going to come back to that later. Why is that important? Because as Confucianism, Buddhism was flourishing that time, and remember I talked a little briefly about that many discipleships ago, what the Nestorian Christians came in. And they were not happy, the Buddhists and the Confucianists. But we'll come to them later, all right? Skipping down, Taisung held a very modern view toward crime, law, and order. So, like typical liberals, he said this: if I diminish expenses, lighten the taxes, employ only honest officials, so that the people have clothing enough, this will do more to abolish robbery than the employment of the severest punishments. The unscriptural idea that only external conditions are the basis for crime is held today as well. Absolutely true. See, it sounds nice, but remember, like I told you, it's an ideal world, right? It's an ideal world. One thing they overlook is the human nature of sin. You notice that? That is always overlooked. Now, look at the paganism of this. This is the same thing like Constantine. Remember when Constantine died, these people, they were like cutting themselves, I think, or like even some of them were stabbing themselves, ripping their clothes. Look at this. Compare the emotional outburst reported when he died. When he died, the grief of the people knew no bounds, and even the foreign envoys cut themselves with knives and lancets and sprinkled the dead emperor's bier with their self-shed blood. Wow. Durant quotes Arthur Waley, writing in the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, as saying, in the Tang Dynasty, China was, without doubt, the greatest and most civilized power in the world. That's why the Tang Dynasty is so important. It became so powerful, that timeline, during the Dark Ages. It was so powerful. And that's when God started to storm in his Christians. And we're going to see that later. Let's keep reading on. At the height of it ruled Ming Huang, the brilliant emperor who ruled for 40 years from 713 to 756 AD, with some breaks in his reign. All right, so now let's cover Ming Huang. Now, look at this mess, okay? Do you think that it will live happily ever after with this kind of society? No, you get drunk on power. All right, communists might say, let's create an equality world for everyone, but guess what? Leaders will be drunk on power. So look what happened. Ming Huang was a complicated ruler who wrote poetry and attacked lands far from home, even exacting tribute from Turkey, Persia, and Samarkand. Wow, that's how powerful. He fell in love with the courtesan Yang Kuei-fei, formerly the concubine of his 18th son. Okay, what a story, yeah. Eventually, there was one of his ministers, Lu Shan. All right, that's where they came across the conflict here. Now, look what happened with their nice, happy kingdom. All right, everything was just going fine until a woman came along that they thought it was worth destroying the world, I guess, or something. All right, look at this. It's kind of the same thing with Troy's fall through Helen of Troy and the Greeks, as you might recall. But let's go back. Lushan the Tatar, read that barbarian, northern provincial governor, who also fell in lust with the woman. Good, he said fell in lust, not fell in love. That's the world, all right? Yeah. He declared himself emperor and a civil war was fought. Lushan called on his barbarian allies and they sacked Chang'an and China, and out of China's already vast population, Durant tells us that 36 million people lost their lives in the rebellion. Now that's stupid, man. Ming Huang won, so he won, but he died a broken-hearted old man. This was the era of the great Chinese poet Li Po, whose mother was said to have had a dream of Venus in China called Tai Po Sing, or Great White Star, at his birth. The Tang Dynasty, however, never recovered from Lushan's rebellion, or the massive destruction left in its wake. No kidding. The great silk roads, the avenues across Asia that brought silk from China and goods from Europe, reached the height of their importance, connecting the Tang capital to what the Chinese called the Western regions. So that's important. The Silk Road, you want to know that because that's how China, news of it reached out toward the West, and this is why you're going to find out Christianity reached there, the Silk Route. That is very important, but we'll come to that later. Let's keep reading. Next came the era of the Five Dynasties and the Liao Dynasty. Amid all of this chaos, one soldier emerged to create the Sung Dynasty. His name was Tai Tzu, the most interesting emperor of the Sung. So now we've already reached several more dynasties here. We've come to the era of the Five Dynasties. And then he mentions also the Liao Dynasty. So we'll just put abbreviation for time's sake. And then he mentions the Sung Dynasty. What do you see what do you see from this lesson? No, nothing. Nothing that the Lord thought worth mentioning in your Bible. Basically, kings and rulers, what? They rise and they fall. It always happens. But God's kingdom reigns forever and ever. But look at his people, the Jews, survived all this time. Look at his people, the spiritual people, the church, still alive this time. God's movement never died out. Amen. The most interesting emperor of the Sung was Wang Anshi. Wang believed that government must hold itself accountable for the welfare of all its citizens. The state should oversee all matters of commerce and industry, as well as government, to keep the working class from being ground into dust by the rich. See, that sounds like your typical day and age where modern-day liberals love that idea. He abolished the forced labor that the Chinese governments had always enacted from the people to build everything from the Great Wall to roads, like the Inca Empire, and we're going to come to them later. The government owned everything and distributed everything. Pensions were provided for the aged and the poor. To fight corruption, he had a budget commission that tightly controlled all money the government received. He put in place universal conscription, where every family was responsible for providing one soldier for the defense of the country. Oh, this is such a wonderful world. His experiment at socialist government failed due to the universal objection to high taxes and absolute government control. See that? Individual will always remain. All right, we're going to close it here. In 950, paper money was first used in China. So that's when paper money was first came to existence, 950. In 970, the first great Chinese encyclopedia was printed. 970. Now they had a Chinese encyclopedia. In 1041, this was enhanced by the invention of the movable type of Pishang. And we close it here. All right. We finished our history. What happened to the Vikings as we close it off? The Vikings ended in this way. No more. Just like the Chinese dynasties and every other empire. Britannica reads, after the 11th century, the Viking chief became a figure of the past. Norway and Sweden had no more force for external adventure. And Denmark became a conquering power. So no more Max O'Neills who are motivated for, let's go for adventure. So because of that, they became no more. They got tired. They settled down. Denmark became a conquering power, able to absorb the more unruly elements of its population into its own royal army. So that's what happened to Scandinavia. Olaf II, Haraldsson of Norway, before he became king in 1015, was practically the last Viking chief in the old independent tradition. Thus, we close the age of Thyatira. But we covered all the unbelievers and the bad guys. Let's cover the good guys during the age of Thyatira. And then we'll finish off the age of Thyatira. And there's obviously the Nestorians, what happened to them, right? They had some action in China. Very interesting stuff. We'll come to them. And then don't forget those old-time Waldensians. Those old-time Waldensians or the Vaudois. So don't forget those guys all the way over there. But basically the root people who are very important at that time, which existed ever since the time of Pergamus, where Constantine started his council and they were condemning every group as heretics, they condemned this one group, the Paulicians. And these Paulicians survived, and then we'll see how they carry on to Thyatira. All right, next discipleship. Let's cover the action. God, my Father, I pray that you'll dismiss us now with your blessing. Thank you so much for so much of learning in our history so that we can see what human nature is capable of and how weak they are and how their systems fall, but that your word stands. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.